the speakers on stage and our audience can hear your question. Again, a reminder, this session is on the record. And now to officially begin, I'd like you to welcome Nancy Bodertha. She's our Vice President of Meetings and Membership here at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you, everyone.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nancy Bodertha. I'm the Vice President for Meetings and Membership here at the Council on Foreign Relations. And on behalf of our President, Mike Froman, and our Board of Directors, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this year's Conference on Expanding Access to International Affairs. For 13 years, this annual conference has brought together students and young professionals from a wide range of backgrounds with the aim of increasing access to and preparedness for careers related to foreign policy. I'd like to thank the two organizations who've supported the Council's commitment to convening this conference each year, GAP, the Global Access Pipeline, and ICAP, the International Career Advancement Program. I extend a warm welcome to the guests and leadership from GAP and ICAP who are joining us this afternoon. And let's give a round of applause to GAP and ICAP for the excellent work that they do. We are so excited to host all of you at the Council, and it's wonderful that our venue is filled with your energy, your curiosity, your ambition, and your aspirations. We've got a robust program in store for you, kicking off this afternoon with a panel discussion on U.S.-China relations. We'll have a short break following the panel, and then there'll be a fireside chat back here with veteran journalist Sewell Chan, who's currently a senior fellow at the USC Annenberg Center on Communication Leadership and Policy. He's also worked at a couple of other outfits that you might be familiar with, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Texas Tribune. He will be in conversation with the Council's Chief Content Officer, Millie Tran. Tomorrow morning after breakfast, we'll hear briefly from the Council's President and former U.S. Trade Representative Mike Froman, and then we'll proceed to a fireside chat with Helene Gayle, who is the President Emerita of Spelman College and the former CEO of CARE. Our moderator for that conversation will be CFR Board Director Sylvia Matthews-Burwell, who's the former president of American University and also the former Secretary of Health and Human Services. Tomorrow, you'll also have a chance to participate in two sets of smaller discussion groups on issues that range from space policy to understanding AI, to democracy in Africa, to navigating careers in the public and private sectors. There will be a networking lunch tomorrow, and our concluding plenary discussion will focus on the impact of the fashion and textile industries on the environment. We end with networking receptions both this evening and tomorrow evening. I urge you to take advantage of these receptions and the breaks between sessions to get to know one another. In fact, I encourage you to set a goal for yourself to leave this convening with at least a handful of new contacts. For those of you in person, we have CFR resources and representatives available throughout the 2 days to discuss the CFR internship, fellowship, and job opportunities. Also, look out for participants who have a red dot on their name tag. These are current term members of the Council on Foreign Relations. This is a special membership program for individuals in their 30s. Find somebody with a red dot and learn a little bit more about the term member program. For those of you who are participating virtually, you can find out more about all these opportunities as well as experience the incredible content that the Council produces if you visit our website, cfr.org. All right, now it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for our plenary on U.S.-China relations. I am delighted to introduce Nancy Yao. She is a longtime friend and a former colleague. Nancy and I actually got our career started here at the council a couple of years ago. We were research assistants in the think tank, and she focused on Asia, and I focused on Africa. The council has factored into other important chapters in Nancy's career. She was a Council International Affairs Fellow in Japan, and I encourage you to find out more about the International Affairs Fellowship Program and keep it in your sights. This is an extraordinary opportunity for early mid-career professionals to spend a year in government or in a think tank setting or abroad in select countries, in addition to Japan, Canada, Indonesia, and a couple of others. But this program has been pivotal for a range of individuals. If you look at the alumni list of people who were, we call it the IAF program for shorthand. So IAF alumni, it's a real who's who of anybody who's anybody in the world of foreign policy. And just a couple of examples. Samantha Power was an IAF in Senator Barack Obama's office. She served as his foreign policy advisor. And Condi Rice got her first government gig through the IAF program, where she was a young staffer working in the National Security Council. So keep the IAF program in your sights. But back to Nancy and her extraordinary resume. In addition to being a research assistant here and being an international affairs fellow, and also being a term member and now a life member, at one point Nancy came back to the council to manage our corporate membership program. And she's got an extraordinary wealth of experience in financial management as well as nonprofit management. And she is currently a dean and professor at Yale University. In your program roster that you received, there's a QR code that you can scan, and you can access Nancy's bio as well as the bio for our speakers this evening. Nancy, it's great to have you here this afternoon, and I'm going to turn things over to you to get our panel started. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. We all looked up to Nancy, so that's the standard of excellence. I don't know how I wiggled my way in. But it's really an honor and privilege, as it was the first day I walked into this building to interview for the position of a research assistant. It is incredible to be with all of you, and it is troubled times. But since there's not a lot to talk about in U.S.-China relations, we can just hang out and, talk Gen Alpha language. I don't know. But not at all, but thank you. And I really preface our conversation, which I'll moderate for about 30 minutes, and then open up to all of you, is that there's the communication channels, I think, in our generations and your generation, I think are very different. And I think that you're getting information in ways that we can't even fully grasp. So it's very much that we're going to be learning from all of you as much as you might be learning from us. So I really welcome that accessibility here and really proud to be a part of this. My pronouns are she, her, I'm still going there. And I have real privilege of moderating this conversation with three incredible experts from different points of view. We have Naima Green-Riley, and she is assistant professor in politics at Princeton's School of Public and International Affairs. I was rejected there twice. And then we have Lizzie Lee, incredible fellow on Chinese economy, Center for China Analysis, Asia Society Policy Institute. And I want to acknowledge that Jennifer Hillman is online and fully engaged in this conversation, is the Senior Fellow for Trade and International Political Economy right here at CFR. So thank you, especially Jennifer, to help, managing this with us. And what we'll do is engage in that conversation, then really prepare your questions, and really encourage all of you to, we're learning. Some of you may be more experts, others are really grasping this for the first time. But to be honest, if the council isn't so timely, they just told Trump to call Xi today, and that's why, they had a conversation today for an hour and a half, and that's why we planned this meeting, because we forecasted that. And there is clear visibility on this relationship. And well, I think I would like to start off with an open question. We'll go to Jennifer first. How would you compare the visibility on the relationship today compared to in the Biden administration midway, if you were to scale it in whichever way you'd want to?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, and I am so sorry that I could not be in two places at once. I was actually involved in a Council on Foreign Relations event this morning in Washington, and there was just simply no way to be teleported to New York. But I'm with you in spirit. Obviously, things are quite different than they've been over time, and that is partly because of the Trump administration's, I think, approach of taking this very aggressive approach towards tariffs with China, which no doubt, absolutely focuses a lot of the attention. And because Trump has made this somewhat of a personal, if you will, trade war. In other words, he's making the decisions about what the tariff levels are, when they're going to go on, when they're going to go off. It has become very much a relationship between President Trump and President Xi, which obviously you saw even in this phone conversation today. The problem in terms of what do we know is that it's very hard to then get a readout. I mean, I've read everything I can get my hands on what happened in that conversation. And to some degree, you still don't really have a very good idea. It was an hour and a half call. We know that much. But if you read what the Chinese side are saying versus what the Trump administration is saying, you get a pretty different picture about what the gist of the conversation was. I mean, to me, the good news outcome is a willingness to continue to talk, and potentially on the trade side to continue to actually enter into negotiations to try to reach something like a trade agreement. For me, the big downside on the trade side is I don't think the kind of agreement that we really need to reach with China is anything that you can achieve at all quickly, or can be achieved just through conversations between President Trump and President Xi. I mean, the kind of changes that we're looking for in China are going to take a long time to work out and are going to require a lot more negotiation and detailed across many different sectors. And that's what I don't see at this point, or don't see immediately coming together.
Right. And Naima, thank you, Jennifer. This definitely, in terms of how Trump is administering conversations, talking to heads of state, or tweeting, or whatever you want to call it, putting it on social media, is obviously a world of difference. How are you looking at this in terms of doing your work every day and analyzing the U.S.-China bilateral relationship?
Well, it's hard not to have a little bit of whiplash, right? Because so it's true, first of all, that sometimes the Chinese and the U.S. sides are saying very different things about what's going on. But also sometimes, even within the U.S. administration, there are many different points of view and many different takes on the relationship right now. So if you look, for example, at Secretary Hegseth at Department of Defense recently said that we need to be concerned about Taiwan, that Indo-Pacific is our priority theater, that there are a lot of concerns about China. Then you look at Secretary Rubio at State Department saying he's going to aggressively revoke visas of Chinese students. Then you've got the president today on the call saying it went well, everything's going fine. And so sometimes even within the same administration, I'm finding difficulty in just trying to figure out what the U.S. position is. And that's because government and policy is complicated. You can have many different things going on at the same time. That still is something that is characteristic of this particular administration. I think that's not necessarily something that happens across all U.S. administrations. So, I mean, how do I do my work? I think you just got to try and synthesize all the information at once. You've got to be reading as much as I try to be reading not only in English, but also sometimes on the side, and just trying to pull in all the different data points and then synthesize it.
And this meeting is on the record, so wanted to remind everyone of that. Lizzie, you're the fellow on Chinese economy. I think a lot of times in the U.S. we're dealing with this whiplash that Amy mentions and refers to, and sort of trying to keep up, right? We're like, every day there's a news pop, and then a lot of people obviously are presenting that that's just a distraction, that the current administration is trying to distract us. Well, sometimes they don't even have the energy to think about, wait, what's happening in Beijing? What is Xi Jinping thinking about? What is the CCP? What are the Chinese companies? You hear a glimpse of it in terms of Zhou Cai saying this here, or the Harvard-China conference some of you may have been to recently. But what is your take on what's happening from Beijing looking out to us?
I think that's a tremendously important question. When we think about U.S.-China relations, we tend to think in terms of global fault lines. But I think what's really interesting and important, especially for us who work at HSI, the Policy Institute Center for Analysis, is to actually probe the system underneath those fault lines. And I think what's really interesting and crucial is we are seeing this interactive tension between Beijing's domestic strategy and external pressure. So on one hand, China's, what's happening at home is shaping China's strategy toward the outside world. And China's domestic strategy is a response also to external pressure. And so we're seeing this, on one hand, what's happening at home is shaping China's external policy. What's happening, externally is also shaping China's policy. So I think that's a really, important part to understand. In terms of what's happening in China, I sort of summarize it in terms of 4 R's. One is rewiring innovation. China's innovation system is vertically integrating at a speed beyond your imagination, especially in AI. Here we're talking about Huawei, we're talking about DeepSeek. It's very much reorganized and re-optimized in the face of external tensions, especially export controls, which did not start with the Trump administration. It actually dated way back to the first Trump administration and also Biden administration. And we're seeing this domestic integration of different suppliers in different sectors of tech. We're seeing this software, hardware integration. We're seeing this whole incentive toward frugality, incentive, innovation under constraint. And I think that's tremendously important. And also the embracement of open source, right? That's going to have huge implications for the efficacy of further export controls on hardware, on chips. The second R I want to point out is the retooling of China's domestic legal and regulatory architecture. Rare earth, right? One key topic of today's Trump call. But rare earth export control is not a response to April 2nd tariffs. It's actually a decade in the making. China has systemically reclassified rare earth as national security asset, as economic imperative, and also as geopolitical lever or geopolitical statecraft. And that only accelerated in response to external tensions, especially export controls on chips, right? Actually, last year, October the 2024, China issued its new regulations around rare earth control, implementing full cycle visibility, putting export on rare earth under much tighter political and security oversight. That happened before tariffs. So China has been preparing this moment, building that lever for long. And it's not just rare earth, right? It's also data security, antitrust laws. So now China has a much more robust set of tools to potentially create pain points when it needs to retaliate against external pressure. So that's the retooling part. And the third part, which I think is probably the most important part, is reshuffling of domestic priorities. So, when we think about China's economic direction, we kind of have this idea of China is closing in, right? It's more inner looking, it's more, it's more focusing on self-sufficiency. But we're also seeing this paradox. Why is China suddenly opening up critical sectors in healthcare and finance to global investment? My answer to that is, this closed versus open is probably the wrong lens to understand the current moment in China's economy. It's a recomposition. And that recomposition is very much driven by what's happening in the US, globally. So we see self-sufficiency, that part is apparent. But why is China opening up its healthcare sector and finance sector? Because that tension abroad actually make it more urgent for China to solve its domestic problems. With the aging society, with its pension system quickly depleting, China actually needs global expertise and global capital to reboost its economy. So we're seeing this reorienting, this reshuffling toward domestic economic policy, toward domestic demand, not just consumption, but a series of socioeconomic reforms. They were earmarked for reform for decades, but now there's renewed urgency here. So this reshuffling of domestic priority. Well, implementation is totally different story because it's always easier to have that political momentum from Beijing, but on the ground, the implementation is highly uneven. And finally, rerouting trade, repositioning diplomacy. Why is China suddenly courting EU? Why is China suddenly warming up to Japan, Korea, and to a greater extent, Southeast Asia? Because its market access in the US is facing problem in light of the tariffs tension. So we're seeing very interesting diplomatic outreach from Beijing to EU, for example. Why is Beijing so urgently consolidating its domestic sector, especially in EV, right? It's overcapacity issue. Because, tensions with EU is no longer just market access, it's actually geopolitical liability. And the market in EU is increasingly critical for Beijing as the US market is closing in. So we are seeing this repositioning, re-engaging. But our expert on this panel is much more well-versed in global trade issues and also engagement with Global South. So I would just leave it there. But I think the general takeaway is what's happening in China is as important, if not more important, than the phone calls, than the trade negotiations. And I think we need to understand how China's domestic strategy is shaping the trajectory of the country's future, but also potentially having implications for the United States and more broadly for the role in the world.
That's so important, especially in your space right now, all three speakers, just in terms of taking ourselves out of that insular space, and really not being so focused on the U.S. perspective, I think is really going to be where we can all potentially add some value in this complex world. Let's take it one step further, thinking a little bit about, does China need the U.S.? Jennifer, what do you think? And if so, what areas?
Does China need the U.S.? In many ways, of course, everyone at some level needs the United States, given, again, the size of our economy and the role that we have played. But on the other hand, China, to me, has been playing this very smart for quite some time. And when I say playing it smart, it's across an entire range. If you think about, for example, when, kind of the World Bank and the United States and others to some degree stopped doing a lot of financing of basic infrastructure, building roads and ports and bridges, et cetera, China stepped into that vacuum with its Belt and Road Initiative. And so China was really trying to say, we can be also a player, we can be a counterpart. When you fast forward now, again, one of the things that China did, and I thought in a very interesting way during the first Trump administration, as the Trump administration started imposing all of those tariffs, which now look mild in comparison to where we are. But what did China do? China retaliated very heavily against the United States, but it lowered its tariffs to many others in the world. And it sought, again, much deeper relationships with a lot of its other trading partners. So China, on the one hand, is signaling, yes, the United States is very important. And on the other hand, it is absolutely doing everything that it can to shore up its relationships with many other trading partners. It's trying to lock in a real, economic ecosystem with China as the hub. And they're doing that in part, again, through a lot of this Belt and Road Initiative, where many, roads and railroads and routes and or in some way hub around China. It is clearly pushing the increase in the amount of intra-Asian trade, to the point where now in the mid 60s, at the amount of all goods that are traded in Asia are made in Asia and are trading inter-Asia. So China is clearly trying to make sure that it does have alternatives to the United States. And the other thing that China is doing, that I think is really interesting is watching what happens with the retaliations that are being done in response to the tariffs. For example, one of the major industries that is being retaliated against as a result of the tariffs is U.S. agriculture. So what does China do? Immediately, it locks in these major sources of long-term contracts for corn and wheat and soy from places like Argentina and Brazil and others. So China is trying to signal that it can get along without the United States, if it has to. And on the other hand, you look at the numbers, just the numbers came out just today for the amount of trade in April, and they're showing, imports into the United States from China at the lowest level they have been since the middle of COVID. So there's no question that what the United States is doing in terms of its tariffs is having an impact on China that is just beginning to really be seen in the sort of numbers and the impact.
I'm getting from some of these comments that we're kind of understanding also what's going on. We're looking in, but yet it's quite difficult to discern compared to the 2014 period and before, in fact. But I wonder if I can ask Naima, thinking about all of the exchange that has happened between the U.S. and China, both at a very high-level bilateral level, but also Obama's 100,000 Strong initiative wanted to send 100,000 of young people to China. And every year, there were upwards of 400,000 Chinese students studying in this country. Not only were they paying predominantly full tuition, which helped support our universities, but also they were creating these grassroots relationships and so many organizations. It seems like many of those organizations and universities in some ways are finding that they feel like that Chinese idiom of like a frog in boiling water. It's just a matter of time when it might implode. How detrimental is the deterioration in that one-on-one people like this in the room who might be in China if not for the current climate, and other members of this sort of NGO, university level, young professional, expatriate population?
The way you asked that question is really interesting because if you think about 10 years ago, we were in the Obama administration. 100,000 strong was the way to go. We wanted to see many different American students traveling to China, learning Chinese. And the climate is just so incredibly different now. And so it really gives one pause. I have been paying close attention to everything that's being said in the administration right now about Chinese students and their ability to study in the United States. And as I say, it's a little bit hard to discern what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks. But of course, there was an announcement from the State Department through a press release that said that Chinese students were going to have some Chinese students were going to have their visas revoked, that there was going to be a focus on students who had ties to the CCP or students who were studying in critical fields, that there was going to be greater scrutiny moving forward on the visa applications of any student coming from the PRC or from Hong Kong. Today in the call, there was a question in the press room to President Trump about that announcement from the State Department, and he said, no, we want them to come, we just need to check people. And so it's really unclear exactly how this policy is going to be operationalized. But I will say this, there are more than 275,000 Chinese students who are studying in China just last year, right, 2023 to 2024. And so it's a huge, huge, huge amount of the international students that we have here in the United States. Actually, until 2024, for about 15 years, Chinese students were the largest number of international students in the United States. At the very end of last year, that number was eclipsed by the number of Indian students. And actually, the reason for that is that since the rising tensions began between the United States and China, though the number of Chinese students have remained high in the US, they've declined since 2019. So every year since 2019, there's been sort of a slight decrease in the number of Chinese students who are here in the United States. And so just in 2024, we saw sort of a decrease that led it to be the second largest group of students. But still, huge, huge number of students who are international who are studying in the US. And I'll add to that, these are students who are contributing to the US economy, to state economies in a number of ways. There was a study that was done by NASA recently that looked at international students and how much they contribute to state economies, not only in the higher education sector, but in surrounding sectors as well. So if you think about international students, they have to come to the United States. They need advisors, they need support. And so there are jobs that are created by students in different states in these universities. Often Chinese students are paying full tuition to go to school in the United States. And so they're bolstering sort of like the budgets of many US universities. It's interesting because it seems like one of the talking points of the Trump administration is that these students, because they're coming and they're sort of bankrolling universities, they're just adding to these multi-billion-dollar endowments of these fancy universities in the US. But it's not just the big name universities that have Chinese students at them. In fact, Chinese students are often going to community colleges or to state institutions that are capped. And so it actually can be very useful to have that tuition contribute to those universities. But in addition to needing advice, and in addition to paying tuition, international students need accommodation, they need transportation, they need dining services. And so this study that just recently came out showed that those contributions are actually creating jobs in other sectors in all the states in the United States. And so it does huge damage to those local economies, especially in college towns, to remove that source of income abruptly if we see rapid cuts to Chinese student visas. And of course, we haven't even mentioned what that's going to do to people who are in the middle of their programs if they have to, of course, leave. And so I'm sort of waiting with bated breath, and I think a lot of people are, to see how this policy on Chinese visas is implemented. But it certainly poses a threat to the higher education sector and to the promise of national intercultural exchange at these universities.
Thank you for that. And I will ask one more question, then open up to the audience. So prepare your questions, and any question is welcome. And because the Council on Foreign Relations is a nonpartisan organization, I want to ask a question that that I've been wondering about. So, given the U.S.-China bilateral relationship, obviously there's quite a bit of criticism around things that China has done, the theft of IPR, and the different human rights conditions in China that the global the global society has definitely criticized in many ways. How much merit is the current administration's thinking around using some of the rationale for its tariffs, whether it's the student visa situation, any of the direct hits that are going to to China or Chinese students? How much merit is some of that foundation? I think because many of us are not studying China full time here, so I want to make sure. I just want to open up a little bit broader to say how much merit is there in some of those conditions that the current administration is trying to present the rationale. Jennifer, do you want to try to? I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I couldn't find my button to. So I think the problem is that there is, on the one hand, this strong sort of bipartisan support of we've got to sort of push back on China. I think that's kind of universally held at some level, and yet, I think really gradations on what exactly does that mean. Again, with really wide ranges, and part of that is you see a lot of difference in view in terms of why did American companies, sort of engage in or go to China in the first place. And again, I think there is a tendency even on this side of the oceans, if you will, to look at this in as though everyone was the same. In other words, as though everyone went to China just seeking, if you will, cheap labor, that this was all about just offshoring U.S. productions in order to gain access to lower cost labor that was damaging to the United States. When the reality is, a huge number of companies went into China because they wanted to sell product into the Chinese market. And so again, to say to them decouple makes no sense because their market is the Chinese market, or maybe more broadly read, the Asian markets. And so it does not make sense even to treat everyone that is doing business today with China as though they were all motivated by the same thing. And that translates into this broader political question of what's the goal here with respect to China? Is it a complete decoupling from China, which many would argue is just completely impossible? But are we trying to get as close as we can to that? And yet, as soon as you say that, those, for example, at the WTO and elsewhere that have looked at it would say, if we do that, if we just try to kind of bifurcate the world into a China-oriented trading bloc and a US-oriented trading bloc, just the fragmentation alone, not changing anything else, just the fragmentation alone could cost as much as 7% of global GDP, and it could be much, much higher for developing and least developed countries, because fragmenting costs. It creates chaos. It creates difficulties with interoperability. It creates inefficiencies in the system, which again, maybe the whole world is willing to bear that cost if we knew why. Why are we going down this road, as opposed to trying to figure out what are the genuine issues that we have, and is there an alternative way, in essence, to work those out? And part of it is also not all goods, not all services, not all products are equal. I mean, again, for the United States, it's not at all clear that we really need to be all that worried about whether it's T-shirts or shoes or other things from China. And on the other hand, where the real serious worries are are around things like critical minerals,
Right.
where between 90 and 95% of the processing capacity for critical minerals, and they have that word critical in them because they are critical, to semiconductors, to military production, to EVs, to batteries, 95% are processed in China. And it will be impossible for the United States to catch up to anything like the level that we will need in terms of both mining and processing of those critical minerals in anything less than decades. So for at least a significant period of time, we are dependent on China. Whether we like it or not, that's where we are. And so whatever our policies are, they have to come from this reality that not everything in China is equal and not everything in the United States is equal. We have to be strategic and smart about when, where, and how we're doing this kind of engagement rather than trying, I think, to come up with some monolithic approach that is not going to fit where the realities are.
That is so important, some of those critical points. And just to elaborate a bit and to pass it over to you, Lizzie, we went conditional engagement, constructive engagement, and clearly over the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years, it's adversarial. China is the enemy. It's a very bipartisan sentiment. And I'm wondering, when you're looking back at your studies and your work, did that happen quite overnight for you? Or how did you think was the trigger that changed it fully into adversarial? Because it seems like it wasn't fully adversarial, but now any organization that tries to engage is kind of feeling like a loner.
Great. I think, I definitely, so I came to the country as an international student back in 2008. So that was during the Obama administration. The atmosphere was very different back then. And I would say, my undergrad institution is highly international. We have a lot of international students on my floor. And looking back, I think that's the most valuable part of my experience. And that's actually why I fell in love with this country and never looked back. But looking back, I think, unfortunately, the United States has lost some of that shine to international students. So I'll start with there. In terms of U.S.-China relations, we do seem to be in a very volatile, increasingly adversarial period of time. But I think, instead of just sinking into those binary narratives, whether we should engage with China or we should decouple with China, I think ultimately it should be a design problem. Are some of the security concerns legitimate? Absolutely. Are some of the human rights practices in China concerning? Absolutely. But how to deal with those issues after you identify them? What I see is a host of very blunt instruments, very blunt tools that are frequently at cross purposes. For example, the China Initiative, right? Are we concerned about, Chinese players, China's whole of society approach, systematically, stealing technology from the United States? Well, there are certainly bad actors, but when you, just hammer down on the entire Chinese American academic community, the chill you put on that, U.S.-China science collaboration is not to the benefit of your goal. It sort of bordered on profiling. It didn't really address the security concerns. If you look at the China Initiative cases, a lot of them are tax compliance issues. A lot of them are reporting errors. It didn't really get the issue you want to get at, right? When we think about the United States economic leverage over China on high tech, yes, U.S. has a lot of leverage there. The U.S.'s, financial system, sanction tools, those can be really pressure points for China. But the way we're using those tools are not the smartest way to use them. What it does is sort of, create this new momentum for China to insulate against those further tools, making China even more formidable rival to the United States, rather than addressing those issues. So what I would call for is engineers instead of politicians working on those issues. There are ways to design a system to build in those guardrails, to build in those buffers, to best leverage China, to best shape China's behavior. And I would argue the best way for the United States to shape China's behavior is, number one, keeping China in its orbit. Because the United States actually have more leverage, especially on international platforms, to use standard setting ability, to use its economic levers, to use its diplomatic levers, to use its power of alliance to actually force China to the table, so to speak. And second, the best way for the United States to shape China's behavior is to start from position of strength. That means domestic economic prosperity. That means the United States, is a broad, prosperous ally framework. But now it seems we're not quite, working in that direction. And the third, I would argue, the best way to shape China's behavior is to understand what's going on in China. And the best way to do that is to have more people in China on the ground so that we don't sink into those just crazy narratives about China being either 10 feet tall or just China collapsed today, tomorrow, maybe last year it should have collapsed. It was a fluke. So once we sink into those very simplistic narratives, we lose sight of what's actually happening in China, and that will make our task to shape China's behavior harder, not easier. So those are my.
Would love your thoughts on this. I mean, decoupling, we're talking about keeping them in the orbit. What do you think is the near-term outlook for trying to maintain this relationship? Because we do know that we need to.
So again, that's.
Oh no, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I think that, it's interesting. We've moved, like you said, totally. We moved to a point in the U.S.-China relationship where we know there's going to be tension. We know there's going to be friction. Even during we talked about the Obama administration, but certainly there was a lot of tension and friction. And one might argue the precursor to some of the things that happened after Obama, during the Trump administration, during the Obama administration, in that the relationship became a lot more fraught. And so I actually think it's going to be difficult to ever envision a time in the near future where we're going to see a lot of cooperation between the United States and China, where we're going to see distinctive projects on which we're partnering together. But I do think that the policy tools that are used by U.S. administrations in addressing China matter, right? And so it makes a difference to make an entire population of students a scapegoat, or to specifically nail down on particular institutions like CSSAs, China Student and Scholar Associations, that might be problematic, or research security methods that might be problematic, or particular programs that might invite less security in a university campus. It makes a difference to decide to completely cut off access to certain journalists from certain organizations, both on the US and Chinese sides, rather than to invite sort of that journalistic lens. It makes a difference. And so I would argue that the best that we can hope for is well-considered policy choices. I'll end on this, though, because I've talked a lot about how there is sort of like a broadening gap between the US and China, especially on the people side, especially on the student side. I was looking into some of those travel numbers recently. B1, B2 visas are the visas that people get when they are traveling for tourism or for business. And so I looked at Q1 2025 numbers, so that's January to April 2025, as compared to last year, 2024, assuming that those numbers would have gone down. And actually, I saw that more than 100,000 visas, a larger increase than 100,000 visas. So basically, there were like 210,000 visas that were given to Chinese passport holders to come on a B1, B2 visa in 2024, 345 this year. And so what that means to me is that not all areas of sort of the people-to-people ties or the international flow between US and China are on the decline right now. And there might be some areas where actually there is an increasing relationship or a continued relationship between the two countries. And so we'll end on that, because I don't want to paint all doom and gloom.
Yeah, that's good. And we'll open up to questions. I want to ask the audience, and try not to abstain. How many have gone on a program into China? Okay, all right, not bad. How many are planning to go on a program to China? Interesting. And how many people use TikTok? I do. Who doesn't use TikTok? I'm just curious. Fascinating. Oh, wow, no kidding. Is that an age thing, or is that just because you don't like TikTok? Let me open up to questions. Wow, I created a debate. Okay, I've got, that's great. All right, and please state your name and your affiliation and ask a question. don't ask a comment, and try to make it as succinct as possible. I have you in the back, yes, you. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Charlotte. I'm an undergrad student at Duke, and I'm studying abroad in NYU, Shanghai in the coming fall, and I'm with the Treasury Department this summer. And my question for you all, the U.S. policy approach of the last 10 years, bipartisan approach, in regards to protecting domestic industry has been one of export controls and economic statecraft in order to properly compete with Chinese industrial policy and overcapacity. And some China analysts have argued that this has been completely counterproductive in that it quickened China's need to become self-sufficient in these critical industries that they deem critical to their national security. So my question is there a way to properly protect domestic industry that isn't entirely counterproductive and that will accomplish our domestic goals while also not quickening the need for the Chinese to become entirely self-sufficient?
Okay, that's a future term member. Jennifer, do you want to hit that? That was a great question. Thank you.
I'll agree with that on the future term member. Excellent question, Charlotte. I think that there is no question that the real trick for the United States across the board is to figure out not just, in essence, how to push China down, but how do we run faster? I mean, how is it that we do, and to some degree, I think you have to do a little bit of both. Not so much the holding China down as much as making sure China competes fairly. So to me, it is appropriate for the United States to use the trade tools in its toolbox to say, you know, if those Chinese goods have been subsidized, yes, we should be putting countervailing duties on them that account for the amount of the production value in China that was paid for by subsidies, so that we're not asking American companies to compete with the subsidies of the Chinese government. But at the same time, and for the same products in the same sector, we've got to be helping our U.S. industries become more competitive. Perfect. So that's everything from helping to support basic research and development to helping develop really higher end and much better quality training programs to develop our own human capital and our own human capacity to engage in those. It includes probably a significant measure of industrial policy, I mean, subsidies on our side, to make sure that our companies can get their hands on the kind of equipment and technology and updates and robotics and all of those things that they need in order to become a really competitive industry. And the last thing, obviously, to me, that it takes is strategic planning. I mean, we simply should not be, engaged in investing in every technology. I mean, there are some, again, that China is doing very, very well that we should simply be buying that. And there are others that are going to be very important to the United States where we need to have our own manufacturing base, or again, we need to do all of these things that will help us, again, run faster at the same time. And the final thing that I think the whole world needs to do is to try to figure out ways to push China to do much more domestic consumption. Because an awful lot of the complaints, particularly in the trade realm, are that China is simply flooding the world markets with very low cost goods that nobody can effectively compete with. And that is because they have got too much capacity in a lot of these technologies. Again, steel is one that sort of leads the way, but that is creating negative pressure across the world. And so I think, again, across the world, there needs to be a collective pushback to say to China, you can't keep producing this much overcapacity. You have to develop either greater domestic consumption at home, or you have to cut back on the amount of overall production in these sectors.
Thank you for that, Jennifer. And I had a question right up front. Yeah. Please stand and state your affiliation.
And I had a question. Are there any of China's policies that you guys feel the U.S. could learn from and implement themselves to their benefit? And are they any of the 4 R's, rewiring, retooling, reshuffling, or repositioning? And what could that look like?
Liz, you want to grab that one? And if we can keep our answers a little succinct, I want to grab at least 2 more questions.
Sure. I would say, the United States can definitely learn from China's industrial policy playbook. For one thing, long-term planning, right? When China talks about, its industrial policy, well, it's made in China 2025. It's controversial, but it's a 10-year plan, right? For the United States, well, policy cycles seem to be every 4 years, the longest, right? You see a lot of whiplashes. And the thing is, for industrial policy to work, it needs to be long-term. It needs substantial front-loaded investment. It needs long-term cultivating, nurturing of nascent industries. It needs policy consistency. When we talk about reshoring, policy needs to be consistent in order for those companies to come back to the United States. If you have tariff today and tariffs off, and if there's no consistency whatsoever, companies are not going to be making that kind of investment. So that's just one thing that I want to focus on. The United States need to think more in terms of long-term planning.
Okay, great. And I have the gentleman in the last row. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Ariana.
I'm sorry, I didn't see you.
All good.
Yeah.
Don't worry.
Hi.
My name is Ariana. I graduated from Hunter College down the street and currently work at McKinsey. So thank you for this panel. I especially appreciated what Lizzie said, that we really need more people who are in the field helping shape policy with China. But I also had a kind of a question, like with this oncoming presidential term, we're seeing a lot of scrutiny with young professionals who have that interest in China, who kind of want to interact with China. And it's kind of especially evident in public facing roles. I myself am going to China in Beijing. I'll be in a program, I'll be studying and like living there for like a year and a half. What advice or affirmations would you have for people who are in these positions that they don't really want to kind of mess it up for themselves in the long run, but the scrutiny in the next 3 or 4 years is going to kind of stay in a permanent record of sorts in their interactions with China, what connections they have with China, or even having friends who are possibly connected to either the CCP or other in other organizations.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a question that I hear actually quite a lot on university campuses, because there are a number of students in the United States, like yourself, who are interested in studying in China or learning Chinese, but are concerned about if later they have to apply for a security clearance to get a job in U.S. government, or want to play some sort of a policy role, whether or not that experience will come back to bite them. And so, I mean, I think it's a valid concern to have. I think that there are some people who have managed to do it. I think that there are people who have focused on the language and really tried to get good at the language. And that, I think, should be a benefit. I say I think because sometimes things surprise me in today's atmosphere. It's getting harder and harder to study Chinese, even in the United States right now, because a lot of the resources going into, for example, Title VI funding are being eliminated. But for the most part, I think it can't hurt to have foreign language skills and to really get good at them. Chinese is a hard language. I've been studying it for more than 10 years and I'll never stop, right? From the standpoint of that's what it takes to get to a level of proficiency and fluency. And so I think that that's something that's valuable at the end of the day, because then you're able to read source materials, you're able to understand meetings that are happening, or even sort of news reports that are coming in. And so I think that that's a valuable thing. And there are still opportunities to go and study in China right now, even though they are being eclipsed by this larger atmosphere. And so I do see students who are going and spending a semester or a term and getting that on the ground experience firsthand. And then they can better speak to the policy issues that are happening right now.
One final question. Is there an international student that would like to? May I call on this international student to see your point of view and your questions?
Thank you so very much. My name is Ali Hassan. I'm a PhD political science candidate at West Virginia University, originally from Pakistan. My question is about the geopolitics of the US-China relationship moving forward. Does the panel think that regional conflicts in different parts of the world, in which the opposing sides tend to have side one with the US or one with China, might involve dragging these countries into that conflict? I'm looking at you, India and Pakistan. You almost went nuclear last month. So do you think these regional conflicts can exacerbate tensions between the US and China, or they could potentially lead to more, mediation efforts in those conflict zones? Thank you.
Maybe Jennifer, do you want to hit on that one?
I think first of all, excellent question. It's great to have you. So thank you for doing that. Look, I think you're hitting it. I think it can be both, depending on the situation. I mean, there's no question that there is a huge possibility for, in essence, the United States to be on one side of the parties in a conflict, and China to be perceived to be on the other, and have it really exacerbate the situation. And on the other hand, I do think in general, I don't see the United States and China as wanting to engage, in a kind of hot war between the two of them. And so I do think there's going to be an ameliorating force to try to say, we don't want to fight a war directly, and we don't want proxies to be fighting it for us. So there really ought to be a huge effort to try to ameliorate those situations. And that may be a real opportunity for the United States and China to work together in order to avoid a conflict among, if you will, proxy states, or those that believe that they have the United States on one side and China on the other. To me, it's not that black and white. There are just not many countries that are wholly, U.S., if you will, and wholly China. I mean, it is all more nuanced than that. And therefore, I would hope that nuance and that sense of how important it is to avoid real conflicts would actually allow the United States and China to come closer together in order to avoid it.
That's wonderful. Final comments. One line that you want to send out to this audience about the U.S.-China relationship. We'll start here, Liz.
I'll just do a follow-up on that question. I think no country is interested in picking sides between the U.S. and China. What's happening, I think, is a lot of countries, regional blocs, are discovering their own agency. The United States is not that reliable as they thought to be. China has its own problems, so what can we do? So what we are seeing, what's really interesting, is this push, this momentum toward regional autonomy, this momentum toward global local model or regionalization in Southeast Asia and also in the EU. So I think that's a fascinating dynamic. Previously, countries are kind of forced into one camp versus other, but now, with this new tension points between U.S. and China, I think a lot of countries, a lot of regional blocs are kind of, discovering their own identity somehow. So I think that's, one emerging area. Again, I'm still observing here, but I think that will be fascinating to watch in this period of U.S.-China.
Final remarks, Amy?
I think that this is the time to really dig into this news, to become more and more proficient in what is happening between the U.S. and China and what's happening in China. And the reason is that because there's so much political rhetoric about China in our news stream today, and it's a lot easier for political elites to lead us to extreme positions if we don't really understand the situation. And so the things that really frustrate me on the policy side are when we completely cut off contact, or we completely cut off, for example, programs, because that's the easiest way to sort of deal with any sort of a threat. But if Americans better understood the situation, if Americans better understood China and what some of the risks of engaging with Chinese entities were versus what some of the benefits and what some of the non-risk factors were, then I think that we could actually have a more robust conversation with our policymakers and maybe influence the policy stream a little bit more. So this is the time to dig in and to become a Chinese policy expert, all of you. So thank you for being here, and please do that.
And the complexities in the relationship, as Jennifer and Lizzie and Naima have shared, are so complex. But what you've witnessed today from all three of them is the nuance and depth of understanding that they have at the complexity and looking at the different points of view. And I'm so grateful for each one of you for joining me in this conversation. I'm grateful for all of you for being so attentive. And please note that the video and transcript of this session will be posted on CFR's website. And if you are attending in person, we'll take a really short, quick break, and then we'll be joined in a fireside chat with my former high school classmate, Siwol Chan. Thank you so much. And think about all those things Nancy Baudertha shared. You're all fabulous. Yeah.